Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Enyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, 7 years ago today, 276 schoolgirls were abducted from their dormitory by heavily armed Boko Haram militants in the remote Nigerian town of Chibok. 57 of them managed to escape and another 50 were later released. But for the rest, their fate remains unknown. And today, we remember them and the ordeal of their families, as well as the unrelenting work of those who, for the last 2,555 days, have campaigned on their behalf as the global search for Nigeria's missing Chibok schoolgirls continues. And later, by some accounts, Nigeria is drowning in debt, with its external debt to total revenue increasing from 8% in 2011 to 400% in 2020. The experts say it is a serious red flag, especially as oil revenue continues to dwindle. It's raised major concerns about debt sustainability, given that Nigeria's total debt service is now clearly more than the country's income. We'll speak to the chairman of one of Nigeria's leading banks coming up. Well, 7 years ago today, the abduction of the Chibok schoolgirls took place in the arid terrain of northeast Nigeria, capturing the imagination of the world and galvanizing the politics and the people here in Nigeria. Arise News was the first international channel to visit the school, meet some of the parents and talk to the girls who managed to escape. I was the reporter, along with producer Rob Bynan and cameraman Jerome Evans, and the helicopter ride to Chibok gave us a good idea of how remote the terrain is and how easy it must have been for Boko Haram to strike and then disappear into the empty spaces. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to members of the Bring Back Our Girls movement who've led the global campaign to rescue the girls. But first, here's another look at that Arise News report that emerged from our visit to Chibok 7 years ago and which resulted in a world exclusive.
This is where most people's trip to the northeast of Nigeria begins and ends. Maiduguri, the capital of Borno State. The popular name used to be Home of Peace, but these days it resembles a fortress. The airport boasts it is one of the best fortified in the world. But it was just the beginning of our journey to find some of the lost children of Chibok.
We're about to get aboard the Nigerian Air Force helicopter that's taking us into Chibok. We're the first international television crew to visit the scene of Boko Haram's most audacious attack. And we're going into some of the most difficult, dangerous and inhospitable terrain in Nigeria.
The helicopter ride gave us a good idea of how remote the terrain is and how easy for Boko Haram to strike, then disappear into the empty spaces. As we approached, you could see from the air just how badly damaged the attack had left the state-run secondary school.
We've just landed in Chibok, within a very short distance away from the school where the girls were abducted. We're just about to get into a number of sort of vehicles, military vehicles, to go in that direction and start talking to the people. So many conflicting reports coming out of Chibok about what actually happened that night. Our hope is that we'll get to the truth of this.
Yet the one thing they never tell you about Chibok until you go there is it is, or was until very recently, just any small town. It's home to about 10 or 11,000 people, most of whom turned out to smile at us as we drove into the center. We were the first international TV channel to get completely free access to the school, and the devastation was clear everywhere. We're in one of the dormitories where the insurgents came in and abducted the girls. You can see the wreck. I mean, these are the actual beds that the girls slept on. Around 11 p.m. that night, the insurgents arrived dressed in military uniforms, came into the dormitories and said to the girls that the town was under attack and that they were there to rescue them. They took them all out into the quadrangle, assembled them there, bundled them into their vehicles and drove them away. They then came back, the insurgents, and razed the school to the ground. Parents and the leading citizens of Chibok gathered under the trees, eager for us to take their stories to the world. And then the girls came forward, shyly at first, as you would expect teenage girls to be, but perhaps more so as they had stared into hell for a time before making their escapes, brave enough to look us in the face, giving us their full permission to show their faces as they brought their stories to the world.
Okay, the time that this thing happened to us, we are in the school, so we are sleeping in the room, and we are hearing the gun, so that we come out and we sit in outside, so that we are sitting, and all the staff they run and they leave us in the school.
Staggeringly, she and her father said teachers had locked them in the night Boko Haram came calling.
The teachers ran away and left them alone. When the guns start sounding in the town, the teachers were still with them, and the teachers, for a small time, they ran away and locked them.
But it's 11 p.m. at night.
Yes,
I mean, do you
there
normally
were
have
some teachers staying inside the compound.
They were sleeping in the dormitory.
They have their house in the school area. Those some of the teachers, they were there.
Yeah, but your daughter was inside the dormitory.
Yes,
the teachers were
those
not inside
teachers
the dormitory.
tell them that don't run. They tell them don't run, and one of the teachers locked the gate, and there is no way for them to escape.
2 others escaped earlier in the abduction, their minds always on the fate of their friends who are still captive after almost a month.
When these people carrying us from here, by the time that we reach a certain bush, so we jump out of the car. After we jump, and then when we passed the night, we saw one man passing by, and we told him to assist us, and he assisted us, and he bring us to Chibok.
So how do you feel now about your friends and the people you know who are still in those camps?
I'm not feeling fine like for them, because I like to go and carry, if people get the way to go and carry them and bring us and bring them.
Do you think they'll be all right?
Yes.
There are signs of the abduction everywhere. The kidnappers burned everything to the ground, perhaps to terrify the town, perhaps to destroy any clues. We found poignant reminders of school-age innocence in the rubble, soap and toothpaste containers, and a multiplication table. This school, which has become the center of the world's attention, could have been any school almost anywhere. It was time to meet the principal and ask her about some of the discrepancies in the accounts. She wasn't there on the night of the abduction.
I was in Maiduguri attending medical treatment. I'm a diabetic patient. I went for medical treatment because every 2 weeks I used to attend the clinic. My daughter, she's not in the hostel. She's in my house. When they heard about the gunshot, then they decided to run away.
There was nothing to corroborate each individual account, and there's been a great deal of finger-pointing and blaming about the attack. We met the man who's the local council chairman and whose own house was destroyed on the night of the raid. He's angry about the speed of the reaction.
I don't feel anything about the house that are going to bones and all that are bones. That is what it matters. But the children, the daughters that are adopted, that is my pain.
How do you feel now that the world is aware of what happened here?
So I feel so fine that the world knows what is happening and they will come to our rescue, to assist and rescue our daughter back to us.
Do you trust the army here to rescue the children and bring them back?
The army here in Nigeria, actually, I cannot tell. Actually, I cannot tell.
The military are very visible in Chibok now. About 3 army platoons were guarding us discreetly, but with enough weapons and in enough numbers to have done something to hold off an attack. Their GOC told us it was a case of resources.
It's on record that the information got to the officer on ground barely 15 minutes before the arrival of the terrorists. And the instant the officer received the information, he moved his troops forward to the general area that he was told the terrorists were coming from. And incidentally, on that day, the attack did not come from only one direction, but from several directions.
Back in Chibok, they haven't started pulling their lives together yet. The girls are still missing, probably split into smaller groups, and it's been a month with no sign of much progress, although there is a mass of international support and sympathy. The parents of those still missing wanted to pour out their feelings.
Some of the Boko Haram, some were on top of the trees, and some were in the forest. And their cars, they parked it in various places. They didn't park it one place. Up to 10:30 a.m. I was seeing them, and no help, so I was forced to come back. I asked some of the vigilantes if we can go. They demanded some money. With the parents, we donated money, and no help.
Women crying, men crying, youths crying, all over. So I thought it's a lie. I just come in. After coming in, everywhere burned up.
It was time for us to leave. Night was falling, and we'd already attracted attention. Since 14th April, this little town gets taken over by whispers and fear when it's dark. We flew out of Chibok, a town still in shock, in a region so difficult to police and secure, and with a ruthless insurgency.
As the military escort that's been with us all day prepares to depart, we're left with many unanswered questions as this harrowing saga of the abduction of the schoolgirls from Chibok continues. For Arise News, I'm Charles Onyegolu in Borno State. And that was 7 years ago when the Chibok girls were first abducted. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we remember those Chibok girls still in captivity 7 years after their abduction by Boko Haram militants. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegolu. So 7 years after they were taken away in the dead of night, the mystery is still deepening, still wrapped in subterfuge, and like everything in Nigeria, politics. The same things that have played out with the previous government of President Goodluck Jonathan are still playing out today with the administration of President Buhari. The same complaints of a lack of feedback, the need for more direct communication with the families and campaigners campaigners and, of course, the rescue of the Chibok girls are still clearly the same demands today. But still, the girls are not yet back, and the Boko Haram threat is still there, yet to be neutralized. Well, in a moment, we'll continue our discussion with leading members of the Bring Back Our Girls movement, which has been campaigning to rescue the girls. But first, a new book by two Wall Street Journal reporters who were based in Nigeria at the time presents the story of the ordeal of the Chibok girls in gripping detail. And recently, I spoke to Andrew Henshaw, one of the authors of Bring Back Our Girls, the global search for Nigeria's missing schoolgirls.
We set off to understand the basic question: why did this take 3 years? When a French family was kidnapped in Cameroon, it took 6 weeks to resolve. 6 weeks, you know? How come it took 3 years just to free a group of young women that seemingly every celebrity on earth had championed? Why? The U.S. sent drones. What did that amount to? You know, countries around the world, China promised satellite footage. Did it ever come? Israel promised intelligence. Canada sent special forces. Nigeria obviously dedicated a lot of effort to this issue. Why did it take 3 years? As we embarked on that question, we found that we couldn't really answer that question without talking about another one, which is, how did these young women survive for 3 years? These were ordinary high school students one day. In a way, extraordinary, because in that part of the country, you know, less than 4% of women in Borno State finish high school education. So already they were extraordinary in that sense. And then they find themselves in these remarkable circumstances. How do you survive? How do you hold on for 3 years while the world, with all its military might and intelligence, you know, fails to find and free you? The suffering that these students endured was extraordinary. At a point, they were eating ants to survive. They were drinking water that was muddy, eating grass. You know, this was extreme suffering. I would also say that, as is common in war, out of that extreme suffering comes extreme heroism. And these women didn't just suffer, they rebelled. They fought back. They refused their captors for 3 years. We followed one of the women, Naomi Adamu, who kept 3 diaries tied to her for 3 years.
And that's Andrew Henshaw, one of the authors of the book Bring Back Our Girls. And with me to continue the discussion of the plight of the Chibok girls 7 years on, we'll be joined in a moment by a leading member of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and former presidential candidate, Dr. Oby Ezekwesili. And here in the studio, Sesugh Akume, a public policy analyst and member of the strategic team of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. Thank you very much indeed for coming in and for staying with us. And it's a very special day indeed for people like you who've been there for the long haul for all those 7 years. You've been remembering today. What have you been doing?
We had a commemoration today, the 7th year of the abduction of the Chibok girls, whereby 276 Chibok girls were abducted in their school in Chibok, as we're aware. 57 escaped, and 219 were missing for years. 105 of them are back, but 112 of them remain captive today for the 7th year. And we had a commemoration to mark that and to call on the government of Buhari to bring back our girls and to do what he ought to do.
Right.
There's so much unknown about what happened, and there's so many questions around that, and nobody's getting any answers. It's time to start getting answers about those.
So what is the Nigerian government telling you and the families of the missing Chibok girls about where things stand today?
Incidentally, that's the issue. The government is not saying anything. The government has chosen to say nothing about it, to do nothing and to say nothing about it. If not to, the decent thing to do is to update the public, the general public, on what is going on. Absolutely. And what has been done on a regular basis. That's what any decent people would do. But even if not the public, even if not the movement, at least the parents, the families should get some consolation to know that this is what's going on, this is where we are, this is what we hope to do, and so on and so forth. There has been no communication whatsoever, not even with the families. And so everybody's in the dark. As a matter of fact, the parents today said they only get to know that anybody cares that the Chibok girls are missing when them Bring Back Our Girls say something about it, or when there's an event, or so on and so forth. Otherwise, the government hopes that they forget about their daughters who have been missing for 7 years.
So there's been no investigation and any subsequent clarity on the circumstances surrounding the abduction?
There has been none. But if that were the only case, it would have been different. The only side of it is that the government has been hiding information that we do not understand. In the first place, on May 18th, 2014, that last administration constituted what he called the fact-finding committee. It was led by General Sabo. It's generally called the Sabo Committee, which submitted its report on the 24th of June that same year, 2014. That report has not been published up to today. So what did they find out? What were the circumstances that led to that? How is it that 7 years on we're still asking basic questions? We asked the government to publish that. We've been asking that for 7 years now. We don't have the answers yet. We even did a Freedom of Information request. We still didn't have that. On 14th of January 2016, Buhari said he was constituting yet another investigative committee to look into that. Nobody knows whether it was ever composed, or whether they actually did any work, or whether he submitted any work. We don't know. Nobody knows anything about it, including the parents. On December 27, 2017, the King Ibe Committee submitted its report. The King Ibe Committee was not specific to the Chibok girls. It was about Nigeria's failed security apparatus. It submitted the report and gave recommendations and all of that. Remember that it's the failure of security that led to the abduction in the first place, and the fact that they couldn't even get the names of the students, they couldn't get anything. It had to be Bring Back Our Girls collating their images and everything, as if there's no government at all. So the King Ibe Committee submitted its report on the 27th of December 2017. It has not been published. Nothing has been done about it, and things keep getting worsened. That's why there have been even more abductions in the past weeks, which means we did not learn anything in the first place. Any normal country would say, this happened, 276 schoolgirls were taken to school, never again. That's what any decent society would do. It never happened, and worse has happened, and now it seems like an industry. It's been aggravating, that's to put it mildly.
So is the horror of Chibok, the lack of clarity about the fate of the girls, and now even more kidnappings of school children, as you mentioned, just another example of a country in much deeper crisis that its leaders are prepared to admit? Indeed, that its leaders are prepared to admit, and the subterfuge about it, and the dishonesty, and the dishonesty about it, and trying to hide the issue and not say anything about it. For instance, on 29th of May 2015, when Buhari was being sworn in as president of Nigeria, he made a solemn declaration, he made a vow that, in his words, he said that Boko Haram terrorists cannot be said to be defeated until all the Chibok girls are back, including others who are in captivity. Those were his words. His speech is there for everybody to see. Our Chibok girls are not back, and yet he, on the 27th of December 2015, he said Boko Haram had been technically defeated. What does that mean? And then 6 days later, when the media asked him where are the Chibok girls, he fled up, and he wasn't happy that he was asked that question. And that's how it has been, an adversarial approach to being asked simply, where are people's daughters? This is the government's duty, security and welfare. People's children are missing. This is the government's job. They're not doing anybody a favor, and when you raise those issues, they don't like it, and then it becomes adversarial, and then they keep quiet about it, and then they do attacks in the media, attacks on personalities, even physical attacks using the police and so on and so forth. And that's what it has been. Even the parents do not know anything that's going on about it. A so-called Chibok desk was set up in the Ministry of Women Affairs to be briefing the Chibok parents, and that it was only on paper. Let me
it never
just ask you to stay
existed.
with us, because we want to talk to you a little bit more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we remember the Chibok girls still in captivity 7 years after their abduction by Boko Haram militants. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagoldo, and I can hardly believe that 7 years on, we're still trying to get behind one of the most troubling and challenging stories I've ever covered. The plight of the kidnapped schoolgirls lured from their dormitory beds by Boko Haram gunmen in the small town of Chibok in Nigeria's troubled northeast. It captured the attention of the world because it was and still is a universal human story, viscerally understood by families all over the world. But as well as the human and family dimension, the story of the Chibok girls still carries a whole series of unanswered questions. And the more we find out, the more we need to ask. And still, the war against the abductors, Boko Haram, a war that desperately needs to be won, is nowhere near its end. And with me to continue our discussion of the plight of the Chibok girls 7 years on, the leading member of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and former presidential candidate, Dr. Oby Ezekwesili. And here in the studio, Sesugh Akume, a public policy analyst and member of the strategic team of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. And let's go straight away to you, Dr. Ezekwesili. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. What are your thoughts today, 7 years after the abduction of the Chibok girls, that you've fought so hard to rescue? I can't hear her, so I don't expect that she can hear me. But we've got Sesugh.
I was muted. Now I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Sorry?
Can you hear me now?
Right. Can you hear me, Dr. Ezekwesili?
Yes, I can hear you, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for joining us and for taking the time to talk to us. What are your thoughts today? You are seen as the leading campaigner from the Bring Back Our Girls movement. You fought so hard, and yet many of the girls are still missing. What are your thoughts at the 7-year mark?
There are 112 Chibok girls and then Leah Charibo that are still missing as a result of those early days of abduction of school children. And on a day like this, when we commemorate the 7 years of the abduction, the only thing that I can say is that I am so shocked at the erosion of governance in our country. The fact that the governmental systems and the leaders failed those girls and continue to fail them and their parents, and the country assumes that a tragedy of that scale can simply be forgotten without resolution. It makes me wonder about our country, and it makes me realize that the basis of our being a country has long been questioned by the way that we treat our human beings.
And has the Chibok story, Dr. Ezekwesili, forced some changes at all on Nigerian politics? I mean, has it made the government more responsive and open, at least in some ways, would you say?
That's exactly my point in my earlier answer to you, that government and its attitude toward the citizen can be assumed to be a generic in our country. There is absolutely nothing that the administration under which the girls were abducted did that's not been done, and even more by this government in office. And I wish that I could say that it was in the positive, but it's in the opposite. It is in the disdain with which they held the parents of the Chibok girls. It is with the absolute lack of priority was not accorded the matter of rescuing the girls. It is in the adversarial, almost, terrible repression of the voices that dared to ask government for accountability for rescue of the girls. It's in the general lack of presence of mind that if you as a government make the mistake of showing a lack of strength and a lack of prioritization of your citizens, that you were going to end up with a Nigeria today where industry has been made of the abduction of citizens. It all started with the kind of way that two administrations consecutively treated these girls. Now, my final point on that particular question is this. We cannot have a society that discriminates between those who are in the poorer segment of our population and those who are middle class or upper class elite of this society. If Chibok girls, and I know this, I've seen it over the course of 7 years, the economics of injustice, that Chibok girls have been ignored in the way they have been, that has happened under two administrations, is an indication of what is wrong with governance and leadership. The poor, the vulnerable, seem not to matter. And yet, in decent societies, your poor and your vulnerable form this epicenter of anything you do about governance.
That's a very good point you've made there, Dr. Ezekwesili. And let me ask you this, though. I mean, because one of the things that stood out with the campaign to get the girls rescued was the international support that came with it. Does the mass of that international support that was mobilized at the outset still remain, or has it all fizzled and dissipated after the whole world was rather moved at the outset by their fate?
I think the world moved on to other priorities once they reckoned that our own country did not consider the matter of our girls' priority, because primarily this is the constitutional responsibility of our own government. What we did by escalating and amplifying the voice of the weak and vulnerable in our society was essentially to say that these girls, if failed by their own government, must be seen as citizens of the world, and that advanced countries with superior intelligence and capabilities should really activate those for the sake of those girls, because no American child or British child would have been taken by terrorists, and the whole world would just simply move on like nothing happened. And that persuaded people enough to show up. But the summary evaluation of most of the countries that showed up was that our governments were unserious, and so they couldn't do beyond what they could do. I remember Prime Minister Cameron telling me of how they had to move their drones that were already steadied for some action when they couldn't get the approval, or the decision rather, of our own government. So they fizzled out. Have you not noticed, Charles, that every time now when there is an abduction of children from school in our country, the world hardly even acknowledges that anything is going on? They are completely in a state of wonderment about our country. And it was Mandela that said that you can tell the state of a people in the way that they treat their children. How could we be a country where we've asked our children to choose between being alive and getting an education in certain parts of this country? It is the most horrendous thing that anyone can imagine.
Dr. Ezekwesili, I want to thank you exceedingly for joining us. And I know you were on your way to an event and you stopped to talk to us, and we're deeply appreciative of that. Dr. Oby Ezekwesili is, of course, a leading member of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and former presidential candidate. And she was talking to me from the southeastern city of Enugu. Now, with me in the studio still, the public policy analyst, Sesugh Akume, who's a member of the strategic team of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And of course, since that terrible event 7 years ago, the Bring Back Our Girls campaign has been at the forefront of public pressure to rescue the girls. 7 years later, where would you say the BBOG campaign is right now?
We made a promise to ourselves and to the Chibok girls, to their families, and we made a commitment and said we would not stop until our girls are back and alive. For us, for each one of us, it's a personal and solemn determination we've made, and that is it. And we're going to be on it until the last Chibok girl is back, however long it takes. Quite frankly, we didn't expect that it was going to take a long time. Quite frankly, nobody thought the country was in such a rotten state, and the government was going to sit up and do something about it and bring back our Chibok girls. It has turned out not to be so, and so it's for the long haul, and that's what is. 105 of the 219 of the Chibok girls are back. We don't know about 112 of them. Each one of them has to be accounted for until we can take our rest, and that's the much we can say. We can also say that hadn't there been pressure on the government to do what it should do, we have doubts, we have evidence to believe that the 105 wouldn't have been back, and so we'll have to keep doing what we're doing, even though the government, even if it's not responding, if it's not doing its job, even if that's not it, we'll keep doing it, and keep amplifying the issues as they are. Well,
we were talking to Dr. Ezekwesili there about the mass of international support, and she admitted that quite a lot of that has dissipated.
Indeed.
What about the Nigerians, ordinary Nigerians? Are they still grieving with the families of those Chibok girls, or do you get the impression that Nigerians have pretty much moved on as well, apart from a small rump of campaigners such as yourself?
Yes, indeed. Nigerians have generally moved on, but we'll have to give a context to this. Remember that at the outset of this, when it happened in April 2014, there were going to be general elections in 2015. This was politicized, as you had earlier rightly stated. Everything in Nigeria is mixed up and mumbled up in politics. So from the outset, some saw us, the movement, as a matter of fact, some people still deny that there was an abduction. Up to today, that's their own coping mechanism, to believe that there was no abduction and the whole thing was a hoax just to remove the last administration from office. And so that has been their own approach to it. There's some who just can't bear the pain of imagining and keeping that thought. They just choose to live in denial of the facts. That's where most Nigerians lie, and quite frankly, you wouldn't really blame them, because today we're talking about Chibok girls. Someone will ask, "Oh, what? Are they not still back?" No, they're not back, and they're not back, and it's just a way of coping, and not everybody can stand has the resilience to stay with that, and so on and so forth. So we can quite understand with that. But our Chibok girls are not back. 112 of them are missing, and each one of them is precious, and they have to be back.
Okay, Sesugh Akume, I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us. And Sesugh is a public policy analyst and member of the strategic team of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. Thank you.